Yesterday marked the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks when Hamas terrorists murdered over 1,200 Israelis and took 250 hostages. We have Haviv Rettig Gur, a political correspondent and senior analyst for the Times of Israel, joining us from Jerusalem. Haviv is probably the most important journalist in Israel, at least as far as I'm concerned. I find myself turning to Haviv not just for information, not just for analysis, but for emotional and moral and spiritual support at this difficult time. So we are so grateful to you, Haviv. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about what the atmosphere is like in Israel right now?
I think yesterday was surprisingly difficult. Obviously, there was an instinct to start trading on social media, passing around the videos, the traumatic videos of many of times of people we know. We are good friends of a family that had 8 members, including a 4-year-old girl, taken hostage on October 7, and family members also killed. It's I don't know. Most everyone I know, my neighbors, my friends, they kind of got off social media, and they kind of ran away from. We had a couple of big dramatic national ceremonies that people tuned into, but mostly it was about staying close to people you know. We got in touch with people affected directly by October 7. It was a coming to it was a remember. That's a great question. How do you summarize a year? It's been a year that never ended, I think is the answer. It's a year, it's a day that still is going on. The enemies that surround us, the forces that have developed this strategy of coming for us and hurting us until we eventually evaporate, which is how they talk about us, have only upped the ante and expanded the fronts. And so the fundamental point seems to me to be that Israelis feel like this is a war launched on October 7 that they still are very much in. I have family members called up now to the reserves in the north. Iran is activating every proxy. It has been for 11 months, 12 months, activating every proxy it has. It feels like an event that's still very much active and moving.
You know, I think there's such a gap between how I think things feel in Israel and how they seem from here. I mean, looking at it from here, it seems like, Israel just had these massive victories, right? The amazing historic pager attack, killing Nasrallah. Things seem to be going pretty well. They staved off this Iranian attack. It does seem like much of the Hamas leadership is dead, gone. It seems that the momentum is behind Israel. Is that something that Israelis are also feeling, or is there a gap there?
The momentum is emphatically with Israel. I would say more than that. If you had talked to Israelis 4 months ago, you would have heard a lot of pessimism and a lot of fear for the future. And it's not fear for the future because we have a sense that our enemies are these immense and powerful threats to us. They're trying to be, but there tends to be a correlation between ruining your own society, being tyrannical and dictatorial and rather abusive to your own people, and wanting to destroy Israel. That tends to, not everywhere, not everyone, but tends to be. And so our enemies are almost self-defeating in that sense. The Iran, I think, has something like 10 times Israel's population and not a very much larger GDP. So we have these enemies that when we decided to pick up that baton, to get up from October 7, dust ourselves off, and make sure it doesn't happen again, to never fall back into this strategic concept, this sort of stupor that we were in, that said that everyone was deterred and the status quo will continue forever, but to understand that we face enemies that actually want to annihilate us. The moment we did that, we became very, very dangerous. And what you saw in Lebanon, that was the crown, the jewel in the crown of the Iranian proxy system. That was the Iranian Empire's great force. When Iran needed to prop up Assad and prevent him from falling, they sent Hezbollah there. When they needed to train the Houthis how to launch missiles, the Houthis can barely piece together bread lines and bakeries. And when they needed competent people to teach them how to handle missiles, they sent Hezbollah. Hezbollah is shattered. It's still there. It's still very much operational. Local commanders have access to large stockpiles of weapons, but it isn't what it was. And I submit to you, and most Israelis think this, and we have polling on this, Iran is far less than it appears. And now that Israel believes that and knows that and feels that, the region is, we are starting to shape our strategic environment instead of just being bludgeoned by it and attacked by it.
Haviv, obviously quite different here in the US yesterday on the October 7th anniversary. I mean, there's a unity in Israel, obviously a very fractious political environment, particularly before with the judicial reforms and everything. But, there's a general sense of purpose, and they understand what's happening, understand people are being evacuated from the north and having to leave their villages, et cetera. When you come to America, because I know you do, Haviv, I left the office yesterday in Midtown Manhattan, took a left onto Fifth Avenue, looked up 2 blocks that were empty at 6 o'clock because they were cleared by the police, and saw a coming throng of people dressed like they were in the Fedayeen, wrapped up tight, fighting the police. Nobody on the side giving them thumbs up or anything like that you see in certain parades and demonstrations. But, that's what we see on the anniversary of the worst slaughter of Jews since 1945. And, how do you, from Israel, view this, that in the United States and also in Western Europe, particularly offensive in Berlin, that this is how this is being, memorialized?
I hesitate to get into American politics, but I'll tell you what it looks like to Israelis, and just get canceled for it. Why not? It is a social sickness. It is a thin and ridiculous elite that has sold its soul to the thrill of a liberation movement it can't imagine, it can't experience, doesn't actually exist on the ground. Hamas launched its major waves of terrorism not in response to occupation, but in response to peace processes. Hamas is the great destroyer of peace processes between the Israelis and Palestinians over the last 30 years. The sense that the thrilling to the brutality itself, to the solidarity, to the feeling that there's something in that jihadi world of authenticity and truth and sacrifice. You have an elite that is so utterly and pathetically bored. And I mean bored. I don't mean bored like you and I could be bored watching TV. I mean bored in the desperate sense of echoing meaninglessness. And so they latch on to these moral narratives that are intentionally ignorant, shrink us all down to cartoons, and allow them to live out these fantasies. And that's one piece. The second piece, the Muslim world is a big place, a diverse place, and in astonishing ways, a beautiful place with some absolutely gorgeous ideas and cultures and, frankly, cuisines. And some of it is utterly sick and collapsing and self-destructive and wants to burn the whole world down because of insane visions of ultimate redemption. And some of it of the Muslim world, you're just importing. You're importing, and your elites are excited to import these radical ideas from the Muslim world because anything that comes out of the global south must be good and anything that comes out of the west must be bad. And so you're seeing a radicalization imported wholesale from the worst things happening in the Arab and Muslim world. It's riding waves of immigration. America has this very, very gentle right now. The British just came out with data. Scotland right now has a unprecedentedly low birth rate. There are 19,000 more deaths every year than births in Scotland, but the population just grew this year by more than at any year since 1941, and it's all immigration. And so you have now European countries that immigration is their fundamental demographic fact, and most people are good people, general rule of life. Some of them, and at large numbers when you have that scale, are going to be these radicals, and they're going to change society. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing that merger.
Let me ask you briefly a question of leadership. When Israelis look at the American presidential election, I know they felt very grateful to Biden for the early support. Of course, now it's been a lot more ambivalent. There's a report that the Harris-Biden team leaked the Israeli targets in Iran to the New York Times. Who are Israelis thinking would have their backs more between Trump and Harris? And then in terms of Bibi Netanyahu, you've been so incredible on the topic because I don't think you're a big fan, and yet your work steel manning his position on Dan Seiner's podcast has been just so powerful. I'm wondering if Israelis are feeling differently about Bibi after the last month and all of the successes in the north.
Let me try and answer what ordinary Israelis think, both about Biden or Harris, Trump, and also about Netanyahu. We know, I mean, there are polls on this, so I can just report easy facts. Trump beats Harris in Israel. And Biden was more popular than Harris, probably just because he's well known. Israelis speak Hebrew in their daily lives. They are provincial foreigners. They don't actually follow day to day the culture wars of America. But Trump seems to be a little bit more pro-us, a little bit less, difficult lately. And so they're responding to that. But Israelis who tend to favor Trump or tend to favor Harris, these are not strong preferences many times. They kind of think whoever's good for Israel, whoever. They all share a sense that America is totally incoherent. And that's the real view. What the heck is the American policy? You arm us massively and then release sanctions on Iran that allows Iran to arm the IRGC massively. Isn't that funding both sides of a war? Mm-hmm. What is the American, if America cut all aid to Israel of every kind, but massively and seriously confronted Iran? Iran has developed in the Middle East a new way of war. And it has to do with technological advances that allow small groups that you wouldn't look at, you wouldn't bother with, the Houthis, backward tribes in the desert that can't run themselves, allows them using new weapons, new missiles, new kinds of technologies to become strategic weapons of war. They have doubled the cost of a container going from China to Europe with nothing, with no actual investment and America's response to that has been the most anemic and ridiculous and careful. And it's not because CENTCOM doesn't have solutions. It's not because the Israeli bombing of Hodeidah that made the Houthis finally sit up and notice that there are vast costs to what they're doing is something the Americans can't do more easily. And CENTCOM wants to do these things. It's the politics. You have real interests, real threats. If America were to face down Iran in a serious way for global order, to end the massive, horrific wars of the Middle East, people think that Gaza is a big deal. There's a constellation of forces that put Gaza at the top of the Western consciousness. Gaza is one of the smallest wars we've had, of the big wars in this region in the last decade. 250,000 Yemenis starved to death just a few years ago in a war. America could have pushed back on Iran. Without Iran, Assad could not have committed his multiple genocides in Syria. Syria was a country that 13 years ago was 10% Christian. This was one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. Syria today is not even 2% Christian. That is a genocide by the definition that we keep hearing about genocide. And nobody cares and nobody notices, and even America, never mind the entire West, won't confront Iran. Never mind Israeli aid, just confront Iran. And if you won't confront Iran, at least don't, while arming us, release their sanctions money so that they can run amok in the Middle East and destroy nations. So that incoherence, right, we now have to hit back on Iran. The Americans are demanding, in order for them to support us in doing so, and there could be a real blowback from Iran, and we want that support, are demanding that we pass the plans by them first for approval. And then they leak them. And then they leak even worse than leaking the targets. Jake Sullivan released quotes from his meeting with the Israeli minister Ron Dermer, in which he said, "We don't trust you Israelis. We don't believe these different plans you're showing us. Just that sense that Israel works at the behest of the American empire is absolutely, exactly, and precisely the opposite message. You want to prevent a war, make Israel look dangerous. You want to prevent a war, make Israel look like the uncontrollable, right, wounded tiger, right, hold me back kind of a thing. But America doesn't appear to understand any of that. And so it arms two sides and constantly weakens its own allies and doesn't understand why its allies don't trust it and doesn't understand why the little Houthis can stop world trade.